On the morning of November 27, 1095, in a windswept field outside the French town of Clermont, Pope Urban II stepped onto a raised wooden platform and prepared to deliver what would become one of the most consequential speeches in all of medieval history. He had summoned bishops, nobles, knights, and churchmen from across the Frankish world. They had gathered for a church council, but what Urban gave them instead was a call to war, one that would echo across Europe, stir tens of thousands to action, and ignite 2 centuries of crusade. Urban spoke not in Latin, but in the vernacular, the common tongue of the people, so that no word would be misunderstood. His message was both terrifying and electric. He claimed that Christianity was under attack. The Holy Land, he said, had fallen into the hands of a people, quote, alien to God, those who defiled sacred sites, oppressed Christian pilgrims, and spilt the blood of the faithful. Jerusalem, the heart of Christian memory and devotion, was no longer safe. He offered his audience a stark choice: sit idle while the faith was crushed, or rise as soldiers of Christ to reclaim what had been lost. But he also offered something more. For those who took up the cross, Pope Urban II promised the remission of sins, an unprecedented spiritual guarantee. Not just penance, not just grace, but complete absolution of sin. Eternal salvation in exchange for armed service. Then came the cry that would define the movement: Deus Vult, or God wills it. Whether the phrase was started by Urban himself or erupted spontaneously from the crowd, the effect was electric. Men tore strips from their tunics to form makeshift crosses and swore to march east. Some were moved by piety, others by guilt, glory, debt, or opportunity, but all of them believed they were answering a divine summons. Yet Urban's sermon didn't come from nowhere. He had spent months preparing it, carefully laying the groundwork, and he knew exactly what he was doing. This wasn't just a religious appeal, it was a political masterstroke. He didn't only call on the lords of France or the knights of Germany either. Urban's message was pan-European. He reached out to, quote, all who are of the Lord, which meant peasants, warriors, clergy, and kings alike, and that breadth was intentional. After decades of internal division between popes and emperors, barons, and bishops, Pope Urban II saw an opportunity to unify Latin Christendom under a single holy cause. And it worked. The First Crusade wasn't just born in that field near Clermont. It was lit like a firestorm. Letters were sent, preachers dispatched, sermons repeated in every village, city, and stronghold across Europe. News spread faster than anyone expected. But here's what makes the moment truly remarkable. Pope Urban II had no standing army at the beginning, no treasury large enough to fund an international campaign. What he had was an idea, a fusion of pilgrimage, penance, and holy war, and that idea swept through medieval Europe like wildfire. Within months, thousands of men, women, and children, nobles and peasants alike, would take up the cross, leave behind their homes, and begin the long, brutal journey east. And not all of them would survive. But none could have imagined what lay ahead. Battles, sieges, starvation, miracles, massacres, and the founding of an entirely new world in the East. This was not a spontaneous outburst of faith. It was a culmination of decades of change. Pope Urban II may have struck the spark, but the powder keg had been building for years. And to understand why the people of Latin Christendom responded with such fervor, we have to take a step back, far back, to the politics of Rome, the rise of the Turks, and the deep fractures that divide the East from West. Because the road to Jerusalem didn't begin at Clermont. It began in the cracks of a crumbling empire and the long memory of a sacred city. To the east, long before Pope Urban II's sermon, another empire was in crisis. The Byzantine Empire, once the eastern half of Rome itself, had dominated the eastern Mediterranean for centuries. Its armies guarded the great cities of Asia Minor, its scholars preserved the knowledge of antiquity, and its emperors ruled from the glittering palace halls of Constantinople. But by the mid-11th century, that grandeur was cracking beneath the surface. After the death of Basil II in 1025, one of the Byzantium's last great warrior emperors, the empire entered a slow and dangerous decline. His successors were weak, short-lived, or embroiled with court intrigues, and the once professional Byzantine army was hollowed out by cost-cutting and corruption. At the same time, the empire's powerful aristocratic families vied for influence, fracturing the empire from within. But the greatest blow came not from within, but from the east. In the 1040s, a new power had emerged on the steppe, the Seljuk Turks. Originally a Turkic nomadic people from Central Asia, the Seljuks had embraced Sunni Islam and conquered a massive swath of territory stretching from Persia to Syria. Their warriors were fast, skilled, and relentless, and by the 1050s, they were pushing deep into Byzantine-held Anatolia, the very heartland of the empire. Then came the disaster at Manzikert. In the summer of 1071, the Byzantine Emperor Romanos Diogenes marched east with a massive army, determined to halt the Seljuk advance once and for all. The emperor knew what was at stake. Anatolia was the heart of the Byzantine Empire, its breadbasket, its military recruiting grounds, and its defensive wall. The Seljuk Turks had been raiding deep into this territory, and Romanos believed that a strong, decisive campaign could drive them back beyond the eastern frontier. His target was the fortress town of Manzikert, near Lake Van in eastern Anatolia, a strategic stronghold recently occupied by the Seljuks. But from the start, the campaign was plagued by poor coordination, bad intelligence, and internal division. Romanos was not only facing an enemy across the field, he was surrounded by enemies within his own camp. Many of the Byzantine generals and nobles who accompanied him were loyal not to the emperor, but to rival factions in Constantinople. Chief among them was Andronikos Doukas, a member of the powerful Doukas family, whose interests clashed directly with Romanos' hold on the throne. Romanos split his forces, sending a detachment ahead to scout and secure positions, while he approached Manzikert with the bulk of his army. But this proved to be a fatal mistake. His divided forces were too far apart to reinforce one another, and Seljuk scouts under Alp Arslan took advantage of the gap, striking hard and fast. As the Seljuks encircled Manzikert, Romanos found himself outmaneuvered and isolated, and then came the betrayal. At the height of the battle, when Romanos ordered a tactical retreat to regroup and form a new line, Andronikos Doukas outright refused to support him. In fact, some accounts even suggest that he intentionally spread rumors that Romanos had been killed, abandoning the field and leaving the emperor's forces in chaos. What followed was a massacre. Byzantine troops, already weary and confused, were slaughtered or scattered. The once proud Roman army disintegrated in a matter of hours. Romanos himself was captured alive, an almost unthinkable humiliation for a Roman emperor. But what came next shocked both sides. Alp Arslan treated his royal prisoner not with cruelty, but with respect. According to the 12th century historian Matthew of Edessa, the Sultan had Romanos brought before him and asked calmly, "What would you do if I were your prisoner?" Romanos replied, "Perhaps I would kill you." Arslan laughed and replied, "But I shall not do that to you." Instead, the Sultan negotiated a pragmatic peace. Romanos agreed to cede territory and pay tribute, and Arslan released him unharmed after only a few days of captivity. And if Romanos thought his ordeal was over, he was very wrong. When he returned to Constantinople, he found that his enemies had moved quickly. Michael Doukas, son of the previous emperor and ally to Andronikos, had seized the throne. Romanos was arrested, blinded, a traditional Byzantine punishment for deposed rulers, and sent into exile, where he died from his wounds not long after. The empire was now leaderless, bleeding, and fractured, and with Romanos gone, there was no one left to contain the disaster. The defeat at Manzikert didn't just break the Byzantine army, it shattered Byzantine authority in Anatolia. Without an organized defense, the countryside was overrun by Turkic warbands. Fortresses fell, entire towns were abandoned. Greek-speaking farmers fled west by the tens of thousands. By 1073, just 2 years after the battle, much of central Anatolia, the very core of the empire, was no longer under Byzantine control. What had taken centuries to build was now falling apart in months. And as the empire descended into civil war, with rival generals and emperors vying for power, the Turks kept advancing. They were no longer just raiders, they were settlers. They established permanent encampments, took over farmlands, and laid the groundwork for a new state in former Byzantine territory. This state, the Sultanate of Rum, would soon make its capital at Nicaea, just a few days' march from Constantinople itself. The Byzantine collapse had begun, and for Latin Christendom, watching from across the Adriatic, the message was clear: the East was open. By 1081, the Byzantine Empire was at its breaking point. For over a decade, civil war, military collapse, and political betrayal had hollowed out the empire that once ruled the eastern Mediterranean. Anatolia, the empire's economic and military heartland, had all but fallen into the hands of the Seljuk Turks. The treasury was nearly empty, the army was fragmented, the frontier had dissolved. And in the capital itself, Constantinople, imperial authority was little more than a shadow. It was in this moment of chaos that Alexios Komnenos seized power. Not with ceremony, but by force. A battle-hardened general from one of Byzantium's oldest aristocratic families, Alexios came from a line of military elites with deep roots in the empire. His uncle, Isaac Komnenos, had briefly reigned as emperor decades earlier. But Alexios was not just a noble by blood, he was a commander by trade, a man who had spent his youth putting down rebellions and fighting border wars. He was only 24 years old when he launched his bid for the throne. With the backing of the powerful Ducas family, one of the most influential factions in Constantinople, Alexios overthrew the reigning emperor Nikephoros Botaniades in a palace coup. To solidify the alliance, he married Irene Ducana, tying the two families together into one of the most powerful dynastic partnerships in the medieval world. But seizing the throne was just the beginning. Alexios inherited a state on the verge of collapse. The imperial army had been gutted by defeats, including the catastrophic loss at Manzikert. The navy had deteriorated. Anatolia, once the empire's core, had been lost to Turkic warlords and was now the seat of the Sultanate of Rum. To make matters worse, Alexios faced enemies on every front. In the west, Norman invaders under Robert Guiscard and his son, Bohemond of Taranto, were attacking Byzantine holdings in the Balkans and threatening Greece itself. In the north, human nomads raided across the Danube. In the east, the Seljuk Turks expanded unchecked across Asia Minor. And in the capital, Constantinople seethed with factional intrigue and palace conspiracies. Alexios responded with ruthless efficiency. He launched sweeping reforms, reorganized the shattered military, and began rebuilding the empire's financial base. He leaned heavily on family networks, placing loyal Komnenoi and Dukai in key positions. He negotiated with enemies when needed, bought time with diplomacy, and played rivals off one another with remarkable finesse. But he knew he couldn't do it alone. To reclaim Anatolia, the empire's core, Alexios needed more than restructured armies or clever politics. He needed soldiers, trained, well-equipped, and ready to fight in unfamiliar terrain. Byzantium's traditional recruitment systems had collapsed, and the local populations of Anatolia had already fallen under Turkish control or fled west. So Alexios made a decision that would change history. In 1095, he dispatched ambassadors to the west, not to kings or emperors, but to Pope Urban II himself, and to the courts of the powerful Latin princes of Europe. This was not unprecedented. The Byzantines had hired Western mercenaries before, Norman knights, Frankish heavy cavalry, and even guards from Scandinavia. But this appeal was different. It came not from strength, but from desperation. And its scope was modest, a request for just a few thousand troops, seasoned fighters who could help push back the Seljuk frontier and restore Byzantine control over key cities and trade routes. Alexios was not asking for a crusade. He envisioned a limited military expedition, something manageable, something he could direct and coordinate, and perhaps even co-opt into his broader strategy of imperial restoration. But Alexios misjudged how volatile the situation in the West had become. He had no way of knowing that Pope Urban II when presented with the Byzantine plea at the Council of Piacenza, would seize upon it as an opportunity to launch something far greater than Alexios ever imagined: a pan-European holy war. By the time the West responded, it wasn't a few mercenaries who came knocking at the gates of Constantinople. It was an army, tens of thousands of knights, foot soldiers, pilgrims, priests, marching under the sign of the cross, calling themselves Crusaders. And though Alexios had hoped to regain lost territory, what he got was an entirely new world. As the Byzantine Empire crumbled in the West, a new and formidable force was reshaping the Islamic world to the east: the Seljuk Turks. The Seljuks were originally a branch of the Oghuz Turks, a nomadic people from the Central Asian steppes. For centuries, they had roamed the region between the Caspian Sea and the Altai Mountains, living in tribal confederations and hiring out their warriors as mercenaries. But sometime in the 10th century, under their chieftain Seljuk ibn Dukak, they embraced Sunni Islam, and with their new faith came a powerful sense of destiny. In the early 11th century, the Seljuks were no longer fighting for others, they were building a world of their own. Their rise began in earnest in 1040, when the Seljuk brothers Tugril Beg and Chagri Beg defeated the Ghaznavid Empire in the Battle of Dandanakan, opening the gates of Khorasan and Persia. From there, they rapidly expanded westward, claiming Ray, Hamadan, and eventually Isfahan as their capitals. In 1055, Tugril rode into Baghdad, the symbolic heart of the Muslim world. The Abbasid Caliph, now more of a spiritual figurehead than a temporal ruler, was under siege by a Shia faction known as the Buids. Tugril drove them out and restored Sunni dominance. In return, the Caliph granted him the title of Sultan, formally investing the Seljuk ruler with authority to protect the Islamic world. This was no small gesture. For centuries, Sunni Islam had been on the defensive. The Fatimid Caliphate, a powerful Shia dynasty based in Egypt, controlled Jerusalem and much of the east. In Baghdad, Shia groups had wielded real power for decades. The Seljuks cast themselves as champions of Sunni orthodoxy, defenders of faith, order, and unity in a fractured world. Under Tugril's successor, Alp Arslan, which means heroic lion, the Seljuk state became a true empire. Alp Arslan consolidated rule in Iran and the Caucasus and began pushing deep into Armenia and Anatolia, Byzantine frontier zones. It was Alp who in 1071 would clash with the Byzantine Emperor Romanos at the Battle of Manzikert, a stunning Seljuk victory that shattered Byzantine control over Anatolia. But the real builder of the Seljuk Empire was Alp Arslan's son, Malik Shah. His reign, from 1072 to 1092, marked the golden age of Seljuk power. Under his vizier, the brilliant Nizam al-Mulk, the empire established a network of religious schools promoting Sunni law and theology. These schools would become ideological pillars in the Sunni revival. Malik Shah also expanded the empire's infrastructure, including observatories and mosques in Baghdad. His court rivaled any in Europe or the Islamic world for culture and power. At its height, the Seljuk Empire stretched from the edges of China to the eastern Mediterranean, from the Aral Sea to the Arabian Desert. But the Seljuks were not a centralized nation-state. Their empire was divided into semi-autonomous regions, each governed by a Seljuk prince or trusted commander. These men ruled as Atabegs, tutors and regents in theory, but independent warlords in practice. In 1073, Seljuk forces wrestled Jerusalem from the Fatimids. Though the city remained open to Christian pilgrims, at least initially, the change in leadership worried many in the West. It disrupted long-standing diplomatic channels and created uncertainty about access to the holy sites. But the real turning point came in 1092, when Malik Shah suddenly died, possibly poisoned. Within months, his vizier Nizam was also dead. The Seljuk world, once vast and unified, began to fracture violently. His sons and brothers fought over succession. Power struggles broke out in Iraq, Syria, and Anatolia. Local emirs declared independence. The Seljuk heartland, once a bastion of Sunni strength, fell into civil war. In Syria, rival warlords clashed for control of Aleppo and Damascus. In Anatolia, the newly formed Sultanate of Rum based at Nicaea, began operating as an independent kingdom, no longer answering to Baghdad. To outsiders, especially to Pope Urban II and the Western Church, this chaos looked like a chance. A divided enemy was a vulnerable one, and with Jerusalem in Sunni hands and Constantinople crying for aid, the time to act had come. What began as a nomadic confederation had become a vast empire, an empire that, in just 50 years, had transformed the Islamic world and became the dominant power in the Eastern Mediterranean. But in its golden age, the seeds of its downfall were already sown, and those cracks would soon be tested by a tidal wave from the west. By the late 11th century, the papacy was in the middle of a dramatic transformation. For centuries, the popes of Rome had struggled to assert authority, not just over the church, but over secular rulers. Kings appointed bishops, emperors crowned popes, and in many cases, the so-called Vicar of Christ was little more than a pawn in the hands of powerful Roman families or German emperors. But in the decades leading up to 1095, that began to change. A movement of reform, centered around the Abbey of Cluny in Burgundy, had swept through Western Christendom. The Cluniac reformers demanded a return to moral rigor, spiritual purity, and church independence. They believed the church should be free from lay interference, especially in the appointment of bishops and abbots. At the heart of this reform was a simple but revolutionary idea. The Pope should stand above all earthly rulers, answerable only to God. That vision came to a head under Pope Gregory VII, who reigned from 1073 to 1085. Gregory clashed bitterly with the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV in what became known as the Investiture Controversy, a political and spiritual showdown over who had the right to appoint bishops. At one point, Gregory even excommunicated the emperor. In response, Henry marched on Rome and installed his own pope. Gregory died in exile, but the principle of papal supremacy survived, and his ideas shaped the future of the church. Which brings us to Urban II, a former Cluniac monk and Gregory's ideological heir. Elected pope in 1088, Urban faced a daunting situation. The church was still divided, its authority contested, and Rome itself was a political battleground. One of Urban's rivals, the so-called anti-pope Clement III, still held parts of the city with imperial backing. But Urban was patient and ambitious. He traveled through southern and central France, building support, rallying bishops, and spreading the reformist message of a unified militant church. He needed something to cement papal leadership, something that could galvanize the faithful and redirect the violent energy in Europe's warrior aristocracy. In 1095, he got it. That spring, ambassadors arrived from the east, envoys of Emperor Alexios, who was fighting to reclaim lost territory in Anatolia. They met Urban at the Council of Piacenza, a massive gathering in northern Italy. There, in front of a crowd so large it had to meet outdoors, the Byzantine envoys described the plight of Eastern Christians and the devastation wrought by the Turks. Urban listened carefully. He knew what Alexios wanted: seasoned mercenaries, perhaps a few thousand knights, to bolster the Byzantine army. But what Urban saw was something far greater: an opportunity. He could transform this local political request into a universal religious mission. A chance to heal the widening rift between Latin and Greek Christians. A way to unite the fractured kingdoms of the West under a common cause. And, perhaps most importantly, a chance to assert papal leadership over all of Christendom, East and West. Later that year, in November of 1095, Pope Urban II arrived in Clermont, a modest city in southern France. But what happened there would change the course of history. The Council of Clermont had been called to address church matters, reform the clergy, and consolidate papal authority in the region. But Urban had something much larger in mind. Over several days, he met with bishops, abbots, and lay leaders, gradually laying the groundwork for his real message. On the 9th day of the council, November 27th, Urban stepped outside the cathedral and addressed a massive crowd that had been gathering in an open field. Some were clergy, some were knights, many were simple peasants. There was no official transcript of what he said, and the sermon we know today survives through multiple later versions, each with its own spin. Still, across all the versions, a few themes emerge clearly. Urban declared that Christianity itself was under attack, that, quote, a race utterly alien to God had invaded the lands of Eastern Christians and was committing unspeakable atrocities. He spoke of churches desecrated, altars defiled, Christians tortured and enslaved. He called Jerusalem, the holy city where Christ had lived, died, and risen, as the prize that must be reclaimed. Robert the Monk had a version of Urban's speech, and he said, "They have invaded the lands of those Christians and have depopulated them by the sword, pillage, and fire. The holy sepulchre of our Lord and Savior, which is possessed by unclean nations, demands to be liberated." Urban urged the faithful to stop fighting one another and instead take up arms for God. This was not a feud, this was not about territory, this was a holy war. And then came the promise that electrified the crowd. All who die on the journey, whether by land or by sea, or in battle against the pagans, shall have immediate remission of sins. This was massive. Until now, penance had meant fasting, prayer, pilgrimage, or giving alms. But Urban offered something new. Go to war for Christ, and your soul would be cleansed. Some chroniclers describe the crowd erupting in tears and cheers. Knights fell to their knees. Others shouted, Deus vult, or God wills it. Urban had done something no pope before him had ever attempted. He had fused religious salvation with military conquest, and in doing so, he lit the fuse for a movement that would reshape Europe and the Middle East for centuries. The First Crusade wasn't born overnight. It was the result of a slow-burning shift in how medieval Christians understood sin, salvation, and warfare. By the late 11th century, pilgrimage had become one of the most powerful spiritual tools in Christian Europe. Traveling to holy sites, especially Jerusalem, Rome, or Santiago de Compostela, was seen as an act of profound devotion. For the devout and the desperate alike, the journey could serve as a form of penance, a way to cleanse the soul and draw closer to God. At the same time, the idea of penance through action, not just prayer or fasting, but real-world sacrifice, was gaining traction. Monastic reformers like those at Cluny emphasized moral purity and also laid the groundwork for something more dynamic. The acts of hardship or risk, done for God, could have salvific power. And what was more difficult or more dangerous than war? For most of Christian history, warfare had been seen as a necessary evil at best. Killing was a sin, even in self-defense. But by the mid-11th century, a new theological framework was emerging. The idea of the, quote, just war, a conflict waged not for personal gain, but for justice and defense of the faith. This is where Pope Urban II's message at Clermont hit like a thunderclap. He didn't just ask people to fight. He cast the crusade as a new kind of pilgrimage, a journey to the Holy Land that would require hardship, but one that would cleanse sin, grant divine favor, and serve the will of Christendom. This was revolutionary. According to Canon 2 of the Council of Clermont in 1095, whoever for devotion alone, and not to gain honor or money, goes to Jerusalem to liberate the Church of God, can substitute this journey for all penance. To medieval ears, this was extraordinary. Not only was Urban promising remission of sins, he was sanctifying violence under the right conditions. Killing the enemies of God, he suggested, was not a crime, it was a form of service. This fusion of ideas, pilgrimage, penance, warfare, and salvation, created something entirely new: the Crusader. Not a soldier of fortune, not a hired sword, but a warrior of Christ, one whose soul was purified by battle, whose death on campaign was not tragic but triumphant. For knights, this was irresistible. Many had spent their lives steeped in bloodshed and warfare, and now for the first time, they were told that these very skills could serve God. For peasants, townfolks, and minor clergy, the appeal was a little different, but no less powerful. They weren't just going to fight, they were going on a journey with spiritual purpose, to see the places where Christ had walked, to suffer as he had suffered, and perhaps to be redeemed in the process. Some even hoped to die as martyrs, to be killed in the Holy Land and thereby secure immediate passage to heaven. In the decades and centuries that followed, this idea would grow and evolve. But here, in the winter of 1095 to 1096, it was something raw and new. A spiritual wildfire spreading across Europe, ignited by the promise that the road to Jerusalem led not to just a city, but to eternal salvation. When Urban II preached the crusade at Clermont, he likely imagined trained knights and seasoned lords answering the call, men with discipline, resources, and experience to fight a holy war in a far-off land. But what actually happened was far more chaotic. The Pope's message spread like wildfire, and preachers took it into the countryside. Monks shouted it from the pulpits. Rumors swirled that the end times were near, that Christ would return once Jerusalem was freed. Word traveled fast, faster than the church could control it. And so, beginning in the spring of 1096, thousands of ordinary people, peasants, craftsmen, women, children, began to pack up their lives and head east. They weren't waiting for noble sponsors or papal approval. They were going now, in the belief that salvation lay on the road ahead. This would become known as the People's Crusade. One of the most famous leaders of this early movement was Peter the Hermit, a charismatic and wild-eyed preacher from northern France. Clad in simple robes and riding a donkey, Peter claimed to have a letter from heaven and personal visions from Christ. He stirred the hearts of commoners with fiery sermons, painting the crusade as not just a mission, but a divine obligation. Behind him, a ragtag army began to form, tens of thousands strong. But this was no professional force. They lacked training, planning, supplies, or leadership. Some even marched barefoot. Others carried rusty swords or farm tools. There were no logistics, no supply lines. Yet they marched with total conviction, believing that God would provide. Among them were nobles of lesser means, like Walter sans Avoir, whose name means Walter without wealth, who joined with his own small band of knights. But for the most part, the People's Crusade was a mass movement of the poor, driven by faith, fear, and desperation. And then, things turned dark. As these mobs made their way through the Rhineland in modern-day Germany, some turned their fury not towards the distant Muslims of Jerusalem, but towards the Jewish communities of Europe. Convinced by apocalyptic fervor that all enemies of Christ must be punished, mobs led by men like Count Emicho of Floenheim attacked and massacred Jews in Minsk, Worms, and Cologne. Thousands were killed in what would become one of the earliest large-scale episodes of anti-Jewish violence in European history. This was not the crusade that Urban had imagined. But the march continued. Peter the Hermit's followers passed through Hungary and the Balkans, often clashing with the locals, stealing supplies, and causing unrest. By the time they reached Constantinople in the summer of 1096, Alexios was horrified. This was no army. This was a moving crisis. Alexios, ever the strategist, offered ships to ferry the Crusaders into Anatolia, partly out of courtesy, but mostly to get them out of his capital. He had no intention of letting them linger. And once in Turkish territory, the inevitable happened. The People's Crusade had no military cohesion. They ignored Byzantine warnings. They launched premature raids into Seljuk lands near Nicaea, hoping for easy victories, and instead they were annihilated. In October 1096, Seljuk forces under the command of Kilij Arslan crushed the Crusaders in an ambush near Chivatat. Thousands were slaughtered. Others were sold into slavery. A few escaped back to Constantinople, including Peter the Hermit, who would later rejoin the more organized Crusader armies. The People's Crusade was over, a tragic mix of faith, chaos, and violence. But it was only the first wave. Behind them marched the real armies. The princes were coming, lords with banners, soldiers who knew how to fight, and they were headed east. If the People's Crusade had been a spark, the Princes' Crusade was the wildfire. Unlike the scattered mobs of peasants who had marched east on pure faith, the second wave of crusaders, known as the armies of the princes, were well-armed, strategically organized, and politically powerful. These were the crusaders' heavyweights, nobles and knights with titles, lands, and trained soldiers at their disposition. And they weren't just answering the call of faith, they were answering the call of opportunity. The Pope had promised remission of sins to any who took up the cross, but the Holy Land also offered honor, glory, and perhaps land for those bold enough to take it. The armies didn't march as one. There was no single commander. Instead, several great lords, each with their own ambitions and baggage, led their own forces eastward, converging over time like rivers flowing into a rising tide. Here were some of the key leaders. Raymond IV of Toulouse, also known as Raymond of St. Giles, a pious and elderly count from southern France, perhaps the most spiritual devout of the leaders. He brought thousands of knights, a strong force of infantry, and a papal legate, Adhemar of Lapuy, who would act as Urban's spiritual representative. Godfrey of Bouillon, a German nobleman and a Duke of Lower Lorraine, known for his humility and battlefield courage, he would become one of the most famous figures of the entire crusade. Bohemond of Taranto, a fiery and ambitious Norman prince from southern Italy, son of the infamous Robert Guiscard, who had once attacked the Byzantines. Bohemond came with a formidable army of veteran warriors and a personal reputation as a cunning commander. Tancred, Bohemond's young and daring nephew, who sought adventure and glory in his own right, also joined the crusade. Robert II of Normandy, son of William the Conqueror, also joined the crusade. He mortgaged much of his duchy to finance the journey. Stephen of Blois, one of the wealthiest nobles in Europe, brought a large and well-equipped force. Hugh of Vermandois, brother of King Philip I of France, arrived early and expected imperial honors in Constantinople. Each of these leaders brought their own entourage of knights, squires, and camp followers, and each had different goals. Some saw the crusade as a path to salvation, and others saw a chance to carve out new kingdoms. And by the spring and summer of 1097, they began to arrive in Constantinople. This posed an enormous problem for Emperor Alexios. He had asked for help, but now tens of thousands of heavily armed Latin warriors were camped outside of his wall. Many of them descended from the same Normans who had invaded Byzantine territory in previous generations. Alexios played a careful game. One by one, he summoned the Crusader leaders to his court. He fed them, gifted them, flattered them, and demanded oaths of fealty. In return for passage across the Bosporus and supplies, they had to swear that any land they conquered would be returned to the Byzantine Empire. Some complied reluctantly. Bohemond, cunning as ever, agreed, though likely with fingers crossed. Raymond of Toulouse refused at first, insisting he had taken the cross for God alone, not for the emperor. But eventually, under pressure, most of the princes swore loyalty. Alexios then did what he had done for the People's Crusade. He ferried them into Asia Minor and toward the waiting enemy. But this time, he wasn't sending pilgrims. He was unleashing an army of knights and nobles, hardened by war and hungry for redemption, conquest, or both. Ahead of them lay Nicaea, the first major test of the Crusade, and the Seljuk Turks would soon learn that this time, the Christians had come prepared. In May of 1097, the Princes Crusade finally stepped into the heart of Muslim-controlled Anatolia. Their destination was Nicaea, not only a symbolic target, but a strategically vital one. Once a prize city of the Byzantine Empire, it had become the capital of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, ruled by Kilij Arslan I. Retaking it was more than a statement, it was a gateway deeper into Asia, and a test of whether this crusade could actually fight a war. The Crusaders had never operated as a single unified army, and by the time they reached Nicaea, they were still arriving in stages, moving separately through Byzantine territory. The first to arrive were the southern French forces under Bohemond and his nephew Tancred, alongside Godfrey of Bouillon and Hugh of Vermandois. Soon after, Raymond of Toulouse and his large army joined them, bringing the main force to somewhere between 25,000 and 35,000 troops, including infantry, knights, and non-combatants. The siege formally began around May 14, 1097. Nicaea was well defended. Its walls stretched nearly 3 miles, reinforced by 240 different towers, and backed against Lake Ascanios. That lake, though picturesque, was a logistical nightmare. It allowed food and supplies to enter the city by boat, nullifying the Crusaders' attempts to starve it out. At first, the Crusaders were woefully unequipped for a proper siege. They had no siege engines, no siege towers, and limited coordination. The early assaults were reckless, relying on frontal charges and ladders hastily constructed from nearby timber. These were repelled easily and losses mounted quickly, but the Crusaders adapted. They constructed fortified camps to protect against sallies from the city and began working more systematically. Tents and palisades dotted the countryside. Each lord controlled a sector of the siege line. They began building catapults and battering rams, drawing on knowledge shared by Byzantine engineers attached to their forces. Still, the siege dragged on. Inside the city, Kilij Arslan was notably absent. He had dismissed the Crusaders as another rabble like the People's Crusade, and had taken his army east to deal with rebellious rivals. By the time he realized the threat was real, the Crusaders had already encircled his capital. In a rush to salvage the situation, Kilij gathered his forces and launched a surprise attack. It was a brutal clash, especially near Bohemon's camp, which bore the brunt of the initial strike. The Seljuk cavalry used their standard tactics, raining arrows from horseback, darting in and out before heavy infantry could close. But this time, the Crusaders held firm. Reinforcements from Godfrey and Raymond arrived just in time, and the knights countercharged, scattering the Seljuk forces and forcing Kilij Arslan to retreat. It was a decisive Crusader victory, and a humiliating one for the Seljuks. Kilij Arslan's army was broken, his camp looted, and his prestige diminished. With no relief army in sight, the city of Nicaea was now cut off by land, but the lake remained a lifeline. That's when Alexios, watching from nearby Pelikanon, made his move. Alexios had no desire to see the Crusaders sack Nicaea. The city had once been Byzantine, and he intended to restore it peacefully to imperial control. So, in a clever logistical maneuver, he had Byzantine ships transported over land, disassembled, hauled across miles of terrain, and reassembled on the shores of the lake. When the ships appeared on the lake, the defenders knew they were finished. But Alexios didn't wait for a bloodbath. He sent his men to secretly negotiate the city's surrender, offering the garrison lenient terms if they yielded to Byzantine forces, and the city agreed. On the morning of June 19th, while the Crusaders were preparing for a final assault, they were stunned to see Byzantine banners already flying from the city towers. The gates opened, not for them, but for Byzantine troops who marched in and took possession peacefully. Now, to the Crusaders, this kind of felt like a betrayal. They had invested blood, sweat, and lives in this siege. The rank and file expected plunder. The knights wanted glory. But Alexios had outmaneuvered them, restoring the city to imperial control, maintaining law and order, and denying them any opportunity to loot it. Tensions began to flare. Some commanders, especially Bohemond, suspected the emperor of playing both sides. But cooler heads prevailed. Oaths had been sworn. Supplies and gold were distributed, and there was still a long road ahead. Nicaea was the first great victory of the Crusade, and its consequences rippled far beyond Anatolia. It restored Byzantine control of a key city. It proved that the Crusaders were more than zealots. They were a serious military force, and it marked the true beginning of a long, bloody campaign to Jerusalem. The Crusaders would now march into the Anatolian interior, through mountains, deserts, and ambushes, towards the fabled cities of Antioch and Jerusalem. But the Siege of Nicaea had shown them something important. This was no pilgrimage, it was a war.